My connection to Yagara country is through my great-granny Maggie King. She is a Yagara, Goanpul and a Nugi woman. She is known on Quandamooka country as Granny Maggie King, a very respected community and family woman. She is related to the Morton family, and therefore they are also traditional custodians of the Yagara, Quandamooka, as well as Kabi Kabi peoples. Her husband, my great-grandfather, Charles Francis King, or otherwise known as Ginter King, was born in Margachin. He was born in a suburb called Bulimba, so in 1867. So we can trace our history back further and further. And he was employed by the government on the 1st of January of 1898. To have an Aboriginal person employed by the government back then, you had to have something going for you. So he was a boatman, and then he became the skipper of the boats that brought everybody from the land in Capalaba, Brisbane City, and take them through the islands of Moreton Bay. And he retired in 1932, and he had a huge article written about him. I was born and bred in Margachin, but I was born and bred under the Aboriginal Preservation and Protection Act of 1939. And even though I was living with my parents, the Queensland government was my legal guardian. So when I was born, I became a ward of the state. My father loved history, and to him, he was proud of the fact that when I was born, it was also when the greatest and biggest revolution took over the world. Now, I can see some of you thinking, what revolution is she talking about? How old is this bird? I think you always be saying that, but that revolution was rock and roll. There you go. So that was the year that I was born. And rock and roll has continued to be a huge part of my life. My first home was in Margachin City, and it was in Victoria Park. And where possibly, we're still keeping our fingers crossed, that the Olympic Games may not be held there, but we're fighting them there. We're still fighting. Thank you. My address was Unit 1, Hut 45, Area 2, Victoria Park, Aboriginal Housing Camp. And by the media, they called it the slum huts of Brisbane, and was demolished in 1960. I'll be turning 70 this year, and I wanted to have my party in Victoria Park. But due to the state government's decision to put an Olympic stadium there, at this stage, I don't think I'll be able to have my 70th birthday party there. They have stopped all events being booked or organised from June the 1st onwards. So today we gather here for the Olympics for the People Summit. I will be speaking for Barambin Victoria Park at 2 p.m. We are not against the Olympics. We are against the state government's stubborn determination to building the arenas in Victoria Park. My journey of being an elder is about working with integrity, respect and pride, but most importantly, it's about deep listening. And that's so important in Aboriginal culture, and drawing on the ancestral wisdom. Sitting at the feet of my elders when I was a young one was the beginning of my reconciliation and leadership journey. But it wasn't called reconciliation, that came in the 90s. It was something that we actioned or spoke up about if we heard something was said about us or did something wrong to us. So I'm going to say, may the biggie, the sun, give everyone here the strength and the wisdom to create a better world for everyone and their families and for the world they live in. Today, I'd like to honour the custodians of this land, my ancestors of the Yagara people, for their culture and their heritage, and whose voices resonate through the trees, the mountains, the rivers, the lakes, the oceans, the land, and also the sky. I also pay respects to elders past and present for speaking up on their past atrocities. This can only empower us to move forward with respect, love and understanding. And finally, I pay my respects to everyone here today. So I welcome you all to this beautiful sacred Jara, the land, in Muggajin, Brisbane, and in Yagara, the country. And sovereignty was never ceded. Berin Marumba, good day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Auntie Sandra, for that incredibly generous and personal welcome to country. We're very, very grateful. And I wish to start our gathering today, our conversation today, our listening today, by acknowledging that we are here in Muggajin country, on the stolen and the unceded lands of the Yagara people. And I pay my respects to the elders, particularly Auntie Sandra, and to all the generations and to First Nations people here today. I acknowledge the deep wounds to their lands and culture as we meet here today in the very location of some of their important pathways and meeting places. And tragically, also the very location of some brutal acts of colonial suppression and attempted erasure. Our cities and our settlements have pretty comprehensively physically erased those places. But people like Auntie Sandra, many generations on, fight to preserve that culture, and we all need to walk together, and you're very generous about this, Auntie Sandra, walk together towards a better future for all of us together. So as we craft the future, and as we think about the design of the infrastructure, of the places and lives we all share, and about the design of the systems that produce them, we really do need to centre that respect and respect the foundational place and spirit, and see our work today and beyond as a path towards the healing of those deep wounds. And I think of that as an act of practical reconciliation. So thank you once again, Auntie Sandra. And I'm Libby Watson-Brown, the Federal MP for Ryan. And I just want to thank you all so much for coming here today to join in this important conversation and this important listening process. And it does look like it's really important to many. When we first started hatching this idea, I was thinking, because I've been thinking about these things, you know, in urban design and infrastructure and places and houses for many, many years, as has Philip and so many of the speakers here today. I thought, it might be a little bit wonky. It might be a little bit, a bit like the sort of stuff that we've been interested in talking about for ages. But it's just so wonderful that there's been such an uptake, and everyone in the community is so concerned about this, and to be able to have a conversation together about what we want and what we expect for this enormous expenditure of the Olympics, and what we need to be brave enough to ask for in our cities and our living places and the places that we share together. So that's what today's for, and that's why we're hosting this Olympics for the People Summit, to hear from you, to actually hear from you. And we do know, and we've invited the community in today, because the community is so often excluded from these conversations, isn't it? Excluded from agency about the future of their own places and their own lives. And that kind of conversation happens at the big end of town, and we're not invited in. And that's been certainly the case for the Olympics here. So we want to open that conversation. One tiny example, I saw another listing pop up on Eventbrite next to ours, and the Deputy Premier is going to be giving an address called Delivering Brisbane 2032, and it's next month. It's just across the road at the Convention Centre. Tickets are $250. Talk about exclusion. If you feel that way inclined, you could go over there, maybe chuck a few bits of rotten fruit. I'm not saying that. But that's how they're treating the Olympics. It's cash for access, isn't it? It's nothing more than that, and I just hope their sandwiches are bloody fantastic. I know ours are today, and thank you to everyone who's been producing sandwiches all day yesterday as well. So that is how they're treating the Olympics. It's cash for access. So today is about you. It's about listening to you. It's about you having a voice. It's about us getting together to interrogate, to discuss, to formulate, to understand together what the Olympics could and should deliver for us, the people of Brisbane, the community, for the greater good and not just for the big end of town. So before I go on, I'll just do a bit of quick housekeeping. You've seen the programs and they're very comprehensive with an outline of today, and you can see that it's very carefully structured to invite you in to listen and converse and to inspire everyone and to give everyone a voice. That is just such a critical part of this because, yes, we've all been excluded. And to gather around the remarkable experts who are here today to share their wisdom and to listen to them and to be able to have conversations with them. And I'm incredibly grateful to all of those great experts who are here today. Thank you for giving up your time. Thank you for, giving us the opportunity to share in your incredible expertise. So at midday after this session, we'll stop and the lunch is at 1:20. It's all over at the B Block Refectory on the other side of Ernest Street. It's pretty hard to find your way around here. I've got to say, this isn't the best bit of urban design in the world. Sorry about that. You've got to try and work it out. And that's very close to the venues for the breakout session. So, the Olympics should actually make our city better for us all, right, shouldn't it? For regular people. Unfortunately, Labor and the LNP are using the Olympics to basically benefit their developer and property speculator mates. And that's going to be driving up house prices even more. House prices and rents already unsustainable in Brisbane. Selling public land, our public assets, and giving billions in handouts in incredible largesse with our public assets. It's just not on. And we do know historically that wherever the Olympics lands in the world, rents and house prices go up. Airbnb moves in. Locals get pushed out of their own city, often onto the streets. We see in commentary from the real estate lobby and big developers that they are absolutely salivating about that. That's good for them. That's good for them. They're salivating about that. Home prices are now already nearly double what they were in 2020 in Brisbane. And the brokers' mortgage choice say that suburbs near the venues could see prices double again before the Olympics. Absolutely impossible for ordinary people to survive in the place. You pay more in mortgages, rates and rent. You get outbid at auctions. You suffer while the big end of town just rakes it in, laughing all the way to the bank. The best part for them is that your tax dollars pay for the whole thing. Labor and LNP's Olympics plan is going to spend $15 billion just on sporting venues and athletes' villages and staging the games. But as it's planned at the moment, it's giving just about nothing back to the community, to ordinary people. That's your dollars going into the coffers of the property companies and the speculators and developers, and you're not getting anything much back for that investment. Meanwhile, house prices are escalating, and it's all about exclusion. It really is. Their plan includes 0 new public and affordable homes. 0. No extra public transport projects compared to before we bid the games. None. This is the $15 billion that's being invested, and actually a huge reduction in green public space. It's outrageous. They're robber barons, and we've got to work out a way of how we get our city back, really, and get our wealth back. Every Olympics is an absolute thrill, we know that, and everyone wants the games to succeed, but right now, regular people are just not invited to that party. And as the games gets closer, the LNP state government, with federal Labor's acquiescence, shamefully, is handing out $3.5 billion to big developers to build athletes' villages with no guarantee that these are going to deliver a single public or affordable home. It's outrageous. I think that this is not just criminally irresponsible, I actually think it's economically irrational as well. And that's just another proof of just how our governments are so beholden to those powerful lobbies and the capital that is behind them. And this is something that we've all got to kind of address and confront and work out what on earth we're going to do about it. And there are going to be plenty of things to stand against, just as we always have, when people calling the shots were more concerned with money than with this city, our shared home. Just like those who tried to save Brisbane's trams when Clem Jones and the car lobby were hell-bent on clearing them off the streets to make space for cars. We remember this, don't we? Just like those of us who tried to stop them when in the 70s and 80s they punched the freeway through those finely woven working class neighbourhoods of Woolloongabba and Bowen Hills. We protested. I was there. I was a uni student at the time. We were lying in front of the bulldozers in Bowen Hills trying to save our precious, fragile, inner urban residential areas. And in fact, that was pretty influential for me. My architectural thesis was actually about, you know, the value and the character and the social value of those precincts and those zones. A lot of them are raised again. Just like those, including some in this room again, who stood up for good sense when Joe Bjelke-Petersen used Expo 88 like a sort of a battering ram to try and enrich developers rather than to the benefit of the citizens long term. But as we'll hear today, we actually did have some wins from that one with South Bank. It could have been locked away. I don't know whether you've all seen the images of it. It could have been locked away as private real estate, but due to public pressure and some good planning, it's now one of our most loved, democratically accessible public spaces. And I think that's a really good benchmark and model. We've talked about problematic urban design across Brisbane, but I think that is an amazing legacy, and that was a legacy because people stood up and demanded that out of Expo 88. Really, really critical. And that tradition has continued with way too many examples to name, right up to today, when our very own Dr. Amy McMahon, the former member for South Brisbane, led the community fight to save East Brisbane State School. Absolutely incredible. She saved it from being demolished for an Olympic stadium, and that's just down the road from here. We're in a pretty kind of interesting nexus here, and a lot of this history has played out around us here. So this summit's an opportunity to look to the future and begin to articulate those things that we actually want from this Olympics, learning from generations before who have dreamed of a better city, and we can harness some practical plans. And I always call this, we've got to have hope, but we've got to have active hope. And we've got to have hope that turns into practical action and practical plans. And I'm really hoping, and I really feel this will come out of today. And we then set about to advocate it, and we advocate for it, and then we make it together. And this is really critical, and that's the way I tend to think as a designer and someone who's been thinking in this space for a long time. We've got to make it happen. It's got to be practical hope, and as I said before, practical reconciliation. Like the people of this city, we were never asked if we wanted the Olympics, were we? I can't remember being asked. They've never asked if we want Victoria Park, Barambin to be stolen again and subsumed by a stadium and its curtilage and private housing. We weren't asked about that. They've never asked us about a better location for a stadium. They've never asked us about how we'd improve public transport, which is so desperately needed across our city. They've never asked us about the need for quality social and affordable housing and what that might be and where that might be. We've never been asked. They've never asked us about how we value and we need our green spaces. Our green spaces. They're taking them away from us, and how they might actually be connected. So today is about inviting you, the community, in. And we've got an amazing program you're going to hear from and get the chance to talk with amazing and active experts here about the things they've been addressing, they've been thinking about, they've been fighting for in their different arenas for many years. So it's a very, very rich program today. We're going to hear from my friend and colleague Philip Thalis. We've been thinking about these things for decades, about lessons from Sydney. Philip was very much embedded in that whole process, and I think it's very telling for us to understand what happened for the Sydney Olympics. Tessa Lego, about greening our streets and public spaces. We're going to hear from Philip Oldfield and Trina Massey about building new homes people actually want to live in, and which they can actually afford. And then from John Piccini, Catherine Bull and Mark Allen about how South Bank was won. From Auntie Sandra, Viv Charlton-Jones and Seal Chong-Wai about the campaign to protect Victoria Park and Barrambin. And of course from Jesper Nielsen and John O'Shuranganathan about whether we should dream about swimming in the Brisbane River. I think we can. I was telling the team the other day about my mother, who's long gone, but grew up in Brisbane, remembering swimming in the Indooroopilly reach of the Brisbane River in the 1930s, you know, where the Indooroopilly Bridge comes across there, in pure blue, clear water, and white sandy beaches were there. So that's 100 years, and this is what's happened to the river in the meantime. We believe it might be salvageable, so that'll be exciting to talk about that. And it is up to us. Real change comes from community power plus political leadership. And this power and this leadership thrives on vision. And today is actually about the vision. Why? Because vision actually is a counterpoint to it, counteracts the government's main weapon that they're using in delivering an Olympics for developers and the property industry essentially, and that is the low expectations of the population. You know, that crushing sense of actually not having any power and not understanding what you can do with community power. People want a better city. Look at us all here. We want a better city. We deserve it. We want beautiful, genuinely affordable housing. We want beautiful public spaces. We want great public transport. But we've all been taught in a way. We've been gaslit and we've been groomed in a way, you know, through rhetoric from politicians, but also from painful personal experience, to expect little. And that is an appalling situation. So we don't talk up, and the government isn't held to account, and they need to be every minute of the day. We can and we must do something about this. I mean, everyone in this room. It's not for just individual groups, it's everyone in this room and everyone in the community. And I look out here and I see enormous, enormous power in that, if we can just harness it. We've got to do something about it. Over the next few years, we need to go out into our communities and raise people's expectations. Teach them to expect more from the Olympics, from the city, from their governments. But before we can do that, we need to see, we need to feel, we need to understand, we need to listen, talk together about it. And I think days like today can light that spark to help shape the vision, to cohere demands which are ambitious, they've got to be ambitious and doable, and to understand that. And we can do that together. So you're up for a very special treat first. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Philip Thalis, a tireless advocate. I don't want to say over how many decades, Philip, for better places for people in his work, which bridges practice, advocacy and politics. So please welcome Philip. Thanks, Philip. Thank you. Thanks.
Hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me to speak in Brisbane. I'm going to share some experiences from the Sydney Olympics, but I'm going to talk more generally about Australian attitudes to city making, to public space, to transport, to greenery, about the value of long-term thinking, about the value of engagement. Thank you to Auntie Sandra. I've got it wrong, but out of town blow-in, but nonetheless I still pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. So I want to take you south to Sydney. I want to take you to Sydney, what's now called Sydney Olympic Park. And it was an area of the city that was very much a dumping ground. It was always retained in government ownership since it was alienated from the Indigenous people, the Darug people of Sydney. So I've put together a timeline. So if you look at the first 200 odd years, we look back at Sydney Olympic Park, and what was today's Sydney Olympic Park, and it was very much used as an institutional dumping ground. So these were the great abattoirs of New South Wales. And when you look at the aerial, so you can see the abattoirs are here. There was the system of grid paddocks. Each paddock had one fig tree in the middle of it for the poor animals to shade under. And then you can see the other elements of the dumping ground. You can see the state brickworks, here are the two pits. And if you look up here, you can actually see a jail. And this is meant to be the only remnant piece of pre-1788 bushland in Sydney, and just to the north of it are salt marshes. But you can see the bay being aggressively infilled. And you can see, in a sense, that they're just dumping things here. This is what's now in the geographic centre of Sydney, but it was 900 hectares of publicly available land. And so, really, as cities grow, these areas all of a sudden find themselves closer to the geographic heart. In fact, it's bang in the geographic heart of contemporary Sydney. And it's a story of change. So, in a sense, this was a lucky happenstance that this was retained in public ownership. The other element that came over here on the western side was the armaments depot with Federation bunkers, and so that whole land was, effectively people were locked out of that whole side. In fact, these are all heavy institutional uses. What happened during the 20th century is so typical of all the Australian cities. Again, the dumping ground of nefarious uses continued. Some good things. The railway actually came to the abattoirs, and in fact there were a number of stations for the workers to come to the area. The military kept that western side. You can see the bunkers there. Industrial uses on the point. You can see the reclamation of Homebush Bay. Pretty aggressive. And that was really Homebush up till 1973, when it was identified by Walter Bunning, the great architect urbanist who built the National Library in Canberra. So he actually identified for the state government at that time, quite nefarious government. You had Berchoki, we had Askin. This report was done under Askin. And he identified this as a great strategic opportunity for Sydney as it moved forward. So when you came to the Olympics in 1992, and this is my photo, that here they are demolishing the abattoirs. But this is very much the site. So Sydney, you'll remember back, was thought of bidding a number of times. It thought of having an expo, which it didn't do for 88, for the bicentennial. You did that. But they thought that they better try to prove their bona fides in advance of the bid. You'll remember that Sydney was up against Beijing. It actually, in the end, won by one vote. You've got to keep, that's very important in terms of the context politically. And they built a couple of venues at Sydney Olympic Park. There'd already been the State Sports Centre built up in the top, and Bicentennial Park, you can see, full of grass up in the northern part. But really, the logo is probably more symptomatic of the mindset of the New South Wales government at the time. A big, happy logo, as if that will sort of win public opinion and show that the site is in any way ready. So the pool and the athletics are very much just, I was just talking to Elizabeth before, the technical term in urban design is plonked there. They were just deposited, but there were several other key terrible decisions by New South Wales government. You can see those sheds up there. They were leased to, who do you think might have leased the strategic holding in the heart of public land? Given just a 30-year lease, Lend-Lease, what a surprise. Having a longer strategic view than government for, of course, their self-interest. And so they built these very poor sheds, which have almost all gone, but that gave them the control in the middle of the site. As young architects, we entered the Olympic Village competition, which was a national competition in 1992, which we co-won. We won our competition scheme is this one with my friends, long-term friends and collaborators, Peter McGregor, Philip Arnold, David Hirsch. And part of our scheme was on the armaments depot. The whole site was on the armaments depot, was actually to connect back into this area to the west. We had a tram line, you can see the red line at the top, and what we wanted to do was actually to promote a gentle green urbanism. We kept half the site as remediated wetlands, and we concentrated the development in mid-rise housing with, based on environmental precedents and principles. They picked, the late architect Darrell Jackson was head of the jury, picked 5 equal winners. There was one planning professor who didn't seem to like any of the schemes. So they kept 5 alive, and instead of competing with each other, we decided to collaborate. We were disparagingly called the village people. We wear it as a badge of honour. And then with other friends, and you can see, you might know Rod Simpson and Andrew Burgess in particular, we then jointly formulated this scheme. In fact, John Hawkins was one of the other winners, but actually pulled out of doing this work. I should mention that in Brisbane. And so this is Rod's drawing of sort of the environmental principles which we all agreed with. And so this was the official scheme for the Sydney Games. And Rod had teamed up with Greenpeace, and Greenpeace brought quite a sort of an activist political agenda, as well as our architectural, urban and environmental agenda, which we all shared. And I was very surprised to actually see the model still existed. It was on an exhibition. I had no idea. We didn't make the model. And you can see then the characteristic of, they really took to heart the greenness in terms of colour. And so you'll see that everything was branded green. They were obviously in competition with Beijing, which is a very dirty city at that time. It's been significantly cleaned since that time. I was actually involved in a Beijing Olympic scheme as well. And Sydney had this sort of breezy, careless, carefree look. And it was very much like a marketing image. And you can see from here, you know, it was sort of like a Tourism Australia campaign under Morrison. You know, it sort of had all the gravity and depravity of that sort of era. And they had this Sydney Olympic plan, which they were very proud of, which you could perhaps today term as their strategy. They actually use these words, from the river to the sea. I think you might find that one resonate, because in fact it went from Penrith to Bondi Beach, and Bondi Beach is the temporary volleyball and Penrith is the permanent rowing. But its centre was Sydney Olympic Park, what's now Sydney Olympic Park on Homebush Bay, right in the geographic heart, and you can see you could get there by multiple means. So this really launched when Sydney won in 1993. You might remember Samaranch, the head of the IOC, saying Sydney, and this really launched the city into a frenzy of inactivity. Because, in fact, there was no plan for Homebush Bay. This is 7 years out from the Olympics. September, wasn't it? 1993. And so there was this frenzy of bad drawings of bad schemes. And so here you can see the existing pool at the bottom, the proposed stadium, then some grand access up to the bay. Meanwhile, the Greiner Liberal government had actually sold off the Western Bank. The only thing that their property services group successfully sold in 7 years of government was actually a key part of the Olympic site. And there were then visions, always be scared of visions, to turn the brick pit, and here you can see the brick pit, you can see the stadia at the top, the athletics and the pool, and you can see the bay in the foreground, to turn it into several prominent architects. I can name them at any point, but we're very keen on these schemes. So they said, we'll replicate Circular Quay at Sydney Olympic Park on the bay, which was a completely fanciful notion. But nonetheless, these received significant press at the time. Meanwhile, the engineers were busily compacting all the rubbish dump, 100 years of dumping. They piled it into hills in red. And so they actually made an artificial landscape at the place of toxic waste dumps which were drained at the bottom, and the leachate drains and the like. So they significantly modified the language of what had been wetlands and floodplains. This isn't my drawing, but it happens to colour Homebush Bay orange. Homebush Bay often portrayed as the most polluted bay in Sydney Harbour. And one of the things they don't talk about in public was, in fact, on the eastern shore, they actually made Agent Orange. So actually Agent Orange is in the bay. So the sense of actually connecting with the bay, you can't fish in the bay even today. So again, the green wash, this was the reality. And so, as I said, Sydney made haste going backwards. And so you saw those plans I showed you before with the, turning the brick pit into water. This is the plan in 1994 1994 by the Homebush Bay so-called structure plan. They've lost any pretense of connecting to the harbour. They don't actually know what they're doing. They've stuck a bit of tennis court over here. They've stuck another facility there. They've stuck another facility here. They're still drawing our Olympic Village. We'll come back to that. So there was actually no plan. So this is 6 years out, same as you now. And I think that the unsung hero, if there's anything good in the Sydney Olympics, we have to thank the architect Lawrence Neal, because Lawrence Neal saw that this was an absolute crisis. He marched into the then minister and said, you need to do something. He organised an international charrette of the best architects in Sydney, and Jean Nouvel and Edith Girard from Paris, who came out and did schemes. And then from the success of that at least focused what was possible, at least filled the void of the absence of a master plan, he then, and this is the brief for that master plan, he then launched the key team that made the master plan, of which I was the sort of token young person at that time. And we came up with the plan in late 1995, early 1996. The clock is ticking. That's 4.5 years out. Nothing is built other than waste dumps at that time. So don't think it's too late. And the plan, this is the core area. The main idea was to stop this scattergun, to actually compact things. And I've got reservations about that in retrospect. But the key thing it did was preserve and create, in fact, Sydney Olympic Park, the parklands, the environmental lands were consolidated and free from intrusion of spot development. And it tried to make an area that was urban. There's a podcast you can listen to on the Institute website with Lawrence Neal and myself, and we talked about Lawrence has actually been involved in many, many Olympic bids since that time, and he says the biggest mistake you can make was, in fact, to build an Olympic park. That is, concentrate your venues together. Sydney at the time proudly said, no other city in the world has concentrated their venues as much as at Sydney Park. Well, why would that be? Because it's a bad idea. So I think Lawrence, in hindsight, very clear-eyed about don't concentrate your venues. There's no benefit of concentrating your venues. And you look at, in fact, recent cities, Paris, a case in point, who haven't concentrated their venues. Nonetheless, we were tasked with a project of long-term city making. Yes, we had the games, but this was going to be a new place in Sydney. And this was quite revolutionary. I'm going to take you back in terms of technology as well. So this was, for me, the most important drawing because I was tasked with the transport integration. This was a projection of Sydney Olympic Park, 365 days of the year. There was nothing there. There was no one there. There were a few people coming for a swim. So you can see the weekends, you can see the Easter show, you can see the big football games and the like. So it was how to actually animate this place and how to stop the worst of business as usual happening. And so this was the plan for the bus stations. You can see two humongous bus stations. You are afflicted with bus stations yourself. Each one $100 million for basically a concrete, sterilised piece of land that would be used perhaps for 2 weeks in the year. And then we did try to reinstate the railway, but in fact, at the time of the bid, they'd actually cut it back to just a stub, which only would have allowed 20 trains per hour through. And so we could, in fact, institute a new loop. And so you can see crude drawings. They're done by my hand, just in pen. They're freehand drawings. You can have all the technology in the world, but actually you need to have a clear strategy. So don't be fooled by these fly-throughs and perspectives. Actually, what's the content behind it? And so we put in place elements of a plan which still hold at Sydney Olympic Park. The railway right in the middle, which is a two-way line that could move 30 trains per hour. I'll talk about that later. A cap of 10,000 cars on the site, which is still, public space is still in place, 100 coach parking, and the buses in the Olympic Boulevard, no dedicated bus station. You spend the money on public space. And there was a lot of detail about taxis, and you can see I'll just go over that. And so here you can see the overall plan. This is the legacy plan, which is quite important because it has then the landscape. You can see how vast the greenery of Sydney Olympic Park is and how that is coming into its own and will continue to come into its own for centuries. The most important thing about public space is to reserve it and to protect it. And then the core with the boulevard, we weren't involved in the detailed design of the boulevard, more the southern end, but the northern end, not so much. So here you can see then the extent of the parkland and its ecological values. Here it is, the timeline I talked about, the master plan in 1996. They could open the showground from scratch in the 1998 show. We do not have a huge problem building things quickly. Australia is actually quite good at that. Brisbane, perhaps less capacity than Sydney. This is 2 years. You can see the stadium under construction. And they opened the station, the railway station, this iconic station, to serve the 1998, the stadium opened in 1999. Everything had been ready and tested to go for the 2000 game. And look what the station was actually meant to do. It had a huge ask in terms of the transport, public transport at the heart of the decision for that place. So these are my photos actually during the games. The station worked tremendously well. It could move. Sydney's got double-decker trains. Just go back one. Double-decker trains, 200 people standing per carriage, 1,600 people per carriage going in two directions at once. Half could disgorge on one side and the other half could load on the other because the Olympics is about getting the maximum number of tickets through, so they have different shifts. And you came out into public space and the boulevard was full. The boulevard was alive because it was designed for the event. And we'll all remember Cathy Freeman, that incredibly daring thing to light the flame and the pressure on her, incredible. So then what's happened since then is the post-Olympic phase. So we had the legacy plan, as I talked about, where we thought that the core would be intensified and the area to the south also built. The Olympic Boulevard, actually most days is pretty sterile down this end. It's actually a paved wasteland. It's not a success. And then the Olympic Village, you can see the overall area, and the Olympic Village, which we'd been involved in, of course, was put out to development consortia. Who won that, you imagine? Lend-Lease and Mirvac. Well, we won the competition in 1992. The secret contracts were signed in 1995. You'll be surprised to know that those contracts are still secret today. This contract for the stadium is still secret today. They're on public land, but they were on public land. And what Mirvac built and Lend-Lease, they built what they always built. They built an enclave trying to actually wall off. They physically walled off. You can see at the top, they actually physically walled themselves off from greater society. Affordable housing, well, that never came up. Public housing never came up, though there was a public primary school built in there. Some good buildings were built. The tennis centre by Lawrence Neal in particular, and the station. And the station, when you talk about Olympic legacy, the station is the most important thing. The renaissance in public transport in Sydney comes from this building, from this work of architecture. People saw that it worked. It worked in the Olympics. It was beautiful. It was commodious. It had a new sort of sense of public purpose, which of course the railways had been devalued for since the time of Bradfield. And what it's really quite directly led to is the expansion of all these new train lines in Sydney, because also we got skilled up in public transport. So the bureaucrats, the architects, the engineers got skilled up in how to deliver these things, as well as the public's expectation that we should have these sorts of goods. In 2004, with colleagues, we worked on then the Sydney Olympic Park vision plan, not my choice of words, and with Tony Caro's fantastic drawings here where the monuments of the Olympics would stay, but it would be intensified and the connections, the openings to the parkland would be opened up. Of course, we had then a subsequent corrupt minister who put the motor racing around the perimeter instead. He's in jail, where he belongs. And we actually looked at real urban planning, and real urban planning is based on public benefit, on public dividends. That's what comes first. Unfortunately, in Australia, you need to marry it with development capacity. So this was actually modelled with new universities and schools and the like, 1.7 million square metres of potential development, but a whole lot of public benefits actually driving, making it a place. So not development-led, actually a balance. Unfortunately, in recent times, so there still is the Homebush Bay Authority, SOPA, Sydney Olympic Park Authority, who are a public authority, but their more recent master plans have been much more development captured. And so I think that's a real negative. The towers in Sydney just get taller and taller. The only limit seems to be the aircraft height limit. Do you have that? I think you might. But the other key thing about the Olympics is the ability to be predictive about the sort of city that you want. And so you might remember in our naive 1992 award-winning village scheme, we actually had a tram to Parramatta. Well, that's actually being built now. So the first stage is open, second and third stages are coming. It didn't need to wait 30 years for that. We should have done that at the time. And we also, when I was involved in the planning, we went to the Department of Transport and said, well, can't you do a through line through the Olympic site? Because that's actually the best long-term thing. And they said, no, we've got no plans. So then we did a loop in order to at least get the capacity. When we looked at the 2004 plan, we again looked at a through line. And of course, that's now being built today with the metro, which is going from Sydney to Westmead. So these things that we were hypothesising about, not airy-fairy, actual tangible projects for Sydney are now being realised. So city making, the long time frame is the most important value to keep front of mind, and governments don't have that. And they need to have that. So Brisbane, you've got a parkland which, like Sydney Olympic Park, had been neglected, mistreated, abused, but it is your largest inner city parkland by a mile, isn't it? And it's in fact on both sides of the alienation of the motorway through the middle. And in fact, the southern bank is actually quite well connected to the city and to the valley. But it is large. So Lawrence Neal in our podcast said that this actually could be the lung for the city because and having been Northern Territory government architect, talked about how the breezes came in across the park, which would actually cool the city as opposed to losing that green reserve so close to the city centre and so embedded in the inner city neighbourhoods. Brisbane, your city perhaps takes the crown as the most brutalised in Australia by the traffic engineer in the car. It's no cause for applause. You're worse than Melbourne. And even Sydney's trying to catch up, but we can't beat you on the brutalisation of the car, of your city. And you've then applied the same narrow engineering, determinist, exclusionary processes to the busway. When you were the last city to pull out the trams, and you, instead of building, if you go to Sydney and walk down George Street now, if you go to any of the European cities, you'll see the tram is actually the catalyst of public space and pedestrianisation. Your busways don't do that at all. They are based on fence-scapes and exclusions, and they don't integrate with the public space of the city. You need to stop this engineering-led attitude to city making. And it's extremely expensive. I can talk fast. Your railway stations look like they're prison exercise yards. They have the most dismal character, the most forbidding character, and I'll be catching this train tomorrow up to see my eldest brother. But the other thing, when you look at the structure of it, you don't have a public transport system fit for the 21st century because it all comes down on one trunk line. I had the misadventure of transferring to the bus at Bowen Hills last year when I was here. The most inhospitable urban scene, completely unwalkable. But also what you see is that compared to other Australian cities who aren't exactly exemplars, you don't have any transport-oriented development. What's remarkable is how few of your stations have any relationship to the urban area that they serve, and how unwalkable, if not positively hostile and unshaded they are. So tomorrow, this is the journey. I'll go up to Mango Hills. And this spur line that was built has been put through the path of least resistance by the engineers, because they build it at the least cost per kilometre. But that means that its potential for integration is zero. You can see the only thing around it, car parks, wetlands, it goes through ecological areas. This is completely the wrong way to build a 21st century city. You have had some successes though. The airport line's good, it's a bit expensive. The 50% public transport, I think a few people in the audience know all about that, is good. The carriages are good from my experience. And you are building cross-river rail. So you'll have seen in Sydney and Melbourne the successes of the new rail lines through the city. And what's quite remarkable when I come to Brisbane is how poor your existing stations are in terms of serving the city centre. So all of a sudden you'll have a street-based station in Adelaide Street, and critically not rely on one trunk line, but actually have much more diversified means of moving around. That's what you need to continue. You should have the successes to this project already in planning. I was very concerned to read this week about the arrangements in terms of privatisation. Gee, it makes Sydney look good that we could maintain a public authority, even though we didn't do that at Darling Harbour. And, you know, the casinos are really the Death Star of Australian cities. All of the Australian cities are blighted by this sort of a Trojan horse of privatisation and corruption. There's no other word for it. It's urban corruption, but I'll leave you know just as much about me as other forms of corruption. But you are pretty good at some micro-urbanism. So Fish Lane takes one of the most unpromising under a viaduct and turns it into something actually good and much more walkable, a real destination. So there's no need, James Street you can point to, you'll point to others. You have some of the best domestic architecture in the world that is a paradigm of tropical urbanism, tropical architecture. You need to replicate this at scale rather than simply boutique backyard developments for people who have the means. There's no urban question, there's no housing question that will be solved by a black glass tower built by a developer. So stop building them. Australia is obsessed by this type. Melbourne is the worst here, but you are catching up, and Parramatta is also shocking in Sydney. Even Woden and Canberra is a shocker. But there are better types, and again, Elizabeth was involved in the early stages of this, so you need to look to Singapore. If you want to look at how to do density well, and this is, of course, a building by the Australian-based Singapore architects, Woha, where they exploded the plan, so it's a breathable building, a lot more perimeter, much better environmental approach to housing, because we are going to have high-density housing, but we need all densities, not simply hyper-density. And of course you do, I remember coming 15 years ago to Brisbane to look at your Brisbane housing company, you do have models of well-designed public and affordable housing. You need to replicate them, magnify them at scale. And you do also have by far the best waterfront redevelopment in Australia, except perhaps its children in Cairns, the like. But you compare this to that appalling Elizabeth Quay in Perth, Barangaroo or Darling Harbour in Sydney, Docklands or South Bank in Melbourne. This is so much better than any aspect of those. So you can do things that are quite exceptional, and you do have some of the best public architecture too by some of the best architects also at South Bank, and that continues to evolve, continues to be a promise, and continues to say there's no excuse for mediocrity or worse. And of course, a tropical green urbanism. I love these remnant trees in the city, but really you could be re-greening your entire metropolitan area, and that starts with stopping the traffic engineer, because they're the most brutal. And you have these beautiful buildings which love the sun and provide deep shade. That's got to be the model. So Brisbane, which Brisbane will you be picking in 2032? Thanks very much.